Despite the fact the OKC Thunder were just eliminated from the playoffs in the second round, the Thunder should be excited about the future of this team. And the biggest reason for that is I believe Shai Gilgeous-Alexander established himself as a superstar in these playoffs. He performed at the level you want from a main option on a contender. However, there was good and bad on tape when it comes to Shai in these playoffs, and while the good do outweigh the bad for me here, I do want to talk about both sides of what I noticed from Shai in these playoffs. But quickly before we go any further, if you're new and like basketball, I'd really appreciate if you would like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, notified whenever I release a video. I make videos about basketball all the time, and liking and subscribing are the two best ways to help me out YouTube algorithm, help support the channel, and help me reach my goal of 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Let's try and get 100 likes on this video so YouTube will recommend it to others. Anyways, let's talk about SGA. One thing I noticed both in the tape and numbers was that Shai had to adjust to physicality. In these playoffs, he shot 54.4% at the rim on 5.7 attempts per game. A new 1 attempt drop in terms of volume and a 12.2% drop in terms of efficiency compared to the regular season. Now, this isn't an overwhelmingly glaring issue in my opinion. This spoke more to Shai having to adjust to physicality in the playoffs rather than his ability at the rim in the playoffs, which, given it was his first time in the playoffs as the main scoring option, it does make a lot of sense. And he also still got to the line at a similar rate to what he did in the regular season. The playoffs are different. Teams are facing the best of the best every game. There's no breaks in between where you can face off against the Wizards, the Pistons, Blazers, etc. And on top of that, I do think OKC's lack of overall physicality, specifically with their bigs in particular, was a factor as well. I think Chet was great in these playoffs as a rookie. He was one of the best defensive players overall, maybe the best player defensively in the playoffs so far. But he's not a very effective screen setter right now due to the leaner frame, and because of that, teams like the Mavs, who have bigs like Gafford and even Lively to an extent, didn't have to worry as much about effective screens when Shai would drive. And Dallas also just had really good physical players like Derrick Jones Jr. and PJ Washington. While Shai has to adjust to physicality long term, I do think he will adjust. I think this was a good test for him. And I also think it's something OKC will address in terms of the team around him this offseason. But where Shai somewhat struggled in terms of rim scoring, he made up for it with absurd mid-range shooting. According to Clean the Glass in these playoffs, Shai shot 47.5% on 8 attempts per game from the short mid-range area. These are shots between 4 feet and just within 14 feet. And he shot 50.9% on 5.3 long mid-range attempts per game, which are shots between 14 feet and just within the 3-point line. These numbers do line up with what he did in the regular season. But what makes it even more absurd to me is that only 7.8% of his mid-range production was assisted on, which means that almost all of his mid-range attempts were self-created, which, given the volume and efficiency on these shots, is very impressive. I think mid-range scoring is one of the most important aspects of playoff basketball, especially for a high-usage player like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. He's not a great three-point shooter, but he's a good one. Given his volume, he has around slightly below to maybe average volume, and he's relatively efficient, enough to leverage it at least. And he also used his mid-range scoring to leverage the other two levels of the court for him. He doesn't have to rely on just forcing three-pointers. He doesn't have to rely on just driving to the basket, because he has the level of the court in the middle of those two where he's one of the best in the NBA at in terms of volume and efficiency. What this proved to me is that Shai has a very translatable skill set to playoff basketball, one that he can use to still play at an elite level even if he still is adjusting to physicality at the rim or isn't the highest volume 3-point shooter. Now, I will say that Shai isn't a great playmaker, and it definitely showed up in these playoffs. He's not a bad playmaker by any means. It's not like he lacks feel for the game completely and is just a non-factor as one. But he did miss the roll man or made a bad pass enough times for me to notice it on tape, especially in the Mavericks series. I've described Shai as someone who doesn't necessarily fit the mold of a true primary playmaker like Luka, Trey, or a prime James Harden, but that doesn't mean he's not a primary offensive engine either. It's his competent playmaking combined with his elite scoring ability that makes him a primary offensive engine, one you can and actually probably should build around. But I do think OKC could use another playmaker next to him, and not one with a weird case and also is ineffective at the sport of basketball at this level. They don't need someone who's prime Chris Paul by any means, but someone who can make reads more consistently and also be enough of a scorer. That might be Cason Wallace, a player they drafted in the top 10 this past year. I really like him a lot. I'm very high on him as a guard for this team long term on both ends of the floor. But if they can't land a big that helps them on the boards at pick 12 like a Donovan Clingan, although I would be shocked if he made it to that pick at all, I do like the idea of them adding a guy like Isaiah Collier, who's one of the best lead playmakers in the class, has some shot concerns, but is a physical athlete with legit handle creation ability and is also still young and not afraid to see. It's not like he's a lost cause in that area. Or they trade down a bit and take a Tyler Kolak, who's one of the more experienced high floor playmakers in this class. Overall, I think this really speaks to how good Shai is though, where I address his concerns that I feel like are real, but also feel like the concerns are ones that can be fixed mostly by adding pieces around him rather than his skill set being a detriment to the team. Even if I have concerns about Shai, things that I've noticed on tape that are flaws, I don't think it actually takes away from how promising these playoffs were for him. He averaged 30.2 points per game, 7.2 rebounds per game, and 6.4 assists per game on 49.6, 43.2, 79 splits, and a 58.1 true shooting percentage. Those are very good numbers for a player in his first playoff run as the main option. And even though they lost the series, he was incredible against Dallas. 32.2 points per game, 8 rebounds per game, 7.3 assists per game, 50.7, 55, 83.3 splits, 59.9 true shooting percentage. He was the best player in that series. A series that included Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, one of the best players in the NBA and historically one of the best playoff performers in NBA history. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was the best player on the floor for all but maybe a game, and even then I would say he was consistently the best player on the floor in those 6 games. He proved a lot of narratives wrong in this series, but the one that stood out to me the most was the fact he proved he didn't need to draw fouls all the time to be effective. He only had 2 double-digit free throw attempt games in this series. He had 4 games where he scored at least 30 points and took less than 10 free throw attempts. 30, 33, and 34 points on 6 free throw attempts each, 36 points on 7 free throw attempts. That, to me, proves he's built for this. He only had 1 game in this series where he had below 30 points. He was the leading scorer in all but 1 game in this series. In that 1 game, Luka only had 1 more point than him. He only had 2 games where he shot below 50% from the field in this series. Ironically enough, the 2 games he shot below 50% from the field were also the ones that he took 10 or more free throw attempts. So while OKC lost this series, Shai left here with something and left an impression on me that makes him very much worthy of that top 10 and also top 5 in the world conversation. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander proved he is a superstar in these playoffs. Not that he really needed to. His numbers from an impact perspective and a production perspective were very much of a superstar prior to these playoffs. But I think this really established it for any of his doubters. While he has some flaws, all players have flaws, even the best of the best, like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And his flaws are ones that can be fixed mostly by building around him. If OKC adds a playmaker that can at least score at an adequate level and make reads a bit more consistently than he does, if they add a big that fits well next to Chet and also can effectively set screens and be a rebounder, because rebounding was a big problem for them, this OKC team that's already looking like a contender will be even more of a threat for a very long time. They were the 1 seed this year. They won 57 games. They had the second best record in the NBA. And they're just getting started. J-Dub is only going to be in year 3. Chet just finished his rookie season. Casey Wallace looks like the next great glue guy for a contender. They have the draft capital to make a move or add another piece. They have a great young core and a superstar level player to build around. Shai proved all the doubters wrong despite not even making it to the conference finals as the 1 seed this year. He proved he can step up and perform at a high level. He was on a team that was the youngest in the playoffs. They faced a team in the second round that had a top 5 player in the world and another elite player next to him, and he was the best player in that series. He proved he doesn't need to foul bait to be an elite player. He proved this season he's not just some empty stats player, although that narrative was stupid to begin with. But what he proved in these playoffs makes me very encouraged because of how he stepped up, because of how his skill set translated, because of how I even think his flaws are ones that speak more to the team around him than it does about him necessarily, at least to a certain extent. This is an MVP caliber player. This is someone you build contenders around. This is someone teams hope they have a chance to get even 70% of when they get the first overall pick in most years. And he's going to be a problem for the rest of the NBA, along with this OKC team, for a very long time.